Hello there guys, we are going to get started now on Cold War Revision Video 3, where we'll be looking at the third part of the spec, which is the USA's involvement in Europe. And you can see the different bits of the spec here. That involves Unit 3. And that is of course the US's policy towards Britain and also Europe. We'll be focusing mostly on Europe, but using Britain as kind of a case study. We'll then be looking at the Marshall Plan, which is, of course, the financial and economic manifestation of the Truman Doctrine, key moment within the early Cold War. And then finally, we'll look at the US's attitudes towards Germany and Berlin, which is really nice because that leads us directly into Unit 4, which is all about the first Berlin crisis. So it's nice because you've kind of got that direct link between Unit 2, the Truman Doctrine, and this unit with the Marshall Plan, and then Unit 4 with the first Berlin crisis. Now, I'm also just going to very briefly explain to us that this should be a slightly shorter video today. It should be a slightly shorter video because if you actually look at the spec here, there is slightly less in the third bit of the spec compared to other units where there just happens to be a bit more. And that doesn't necessarily mean that this is less important as a bit of the spec. It could still come up. It's still really important. It just means that actually maybe we need to know these three bits in a bit more detail as opposed to kind of breadth where there might be a bit more in other parts of the specification. So without further ado, let's get moving. And we are going to start by thinking about the US's foreign policy more generally between 1945 and 46. And in order to do that, I think we need to look at US foreign policy throughout the majority of the first part of the 20th century. Okay, so I'm talking about the early 20th century here. And I think it's fair to say that the USA has traditionally across the early part of the 20th century had quite an isolationist attitude. What we mean by that is that the United States of America hasn't really seen European matters as within its sphere of influence or its sphere of interest, should we say, and therefore something that the US should necessarily intervene in. We see that in the First World War, where the Americans only entered towards the end of the war in 1917. And then we also see that in the Second World War as well, where the US only enters in 1941, of course, after Pearl Harbor. So what we're saying is if we're looking at the first part of the 20th century, the US has quite an isolationist attitude. It's not this dominant force on the global stage. It's not the world's policeman. It doesn't take a leading role in world affairs. But that does, of course, shift after the end of the Second World War. We can see it in the kind of 1940s with Bretton Woods in 1944. You don't need to know that for this course, but if you're an economist, please search up Bretton Woods. It's hugely significant. But equally at the wartime conferences as well, the Americans play an increasing role in establishing the kind of wider international architecture that's going to decide the world when we think about things like the UN, etc., etc. But it is worth establishing that the US didn't want deep entanglement to start with. They shift towards this between 46 to 47. Please don't do 67, as we'll see throughout this video. And I think this cartoon illustrates it just perfectly. This cartoon that shares what a lucky thing we've got separate beds. And you can see here, of course, this man representing the United States of America having his own bed and not being caught with the contagion in Europe with Stalin-itch, Hitleritis, Blitzpock, Nazi fever, and fascist fever. Italian mumps you've got here as well. And this actually comes from kind of early 1941, before the US do decide to intervene and get involved in World War II. So that's just to set the scene that there was nothing inevitable about increasing US intervention in Europe. And actually, as we'll see in 1945, the US don't really demonstrate that they want to be as involved in Europe as maybe they could be. So this man, for those of you that don't know, is probably one of the most important people in economics, alongside Adam Smith, of course. This man is John Maynard Keynes, okay? For those of you that do not know him, and I'm going to spell his name right, John Maynard Keynes, okay? Who is one of the most important people in modern economics, really. He's a British man, and in 1945, in the summer of 1945, he was tasked with a job by Clement Attlee's newly found Labour government. And his job was essentially to travel to Washington and to negotiate a loan for Britain because Britain was bankrupt. So in 1945, John Maynard Keynes, he travels to Washington. Britain's bankrupt. There's been 6 years of total war. It's drained Britain's gold reserves. Its industry is completely exhausted. The empire, the British Empire, is just economically shattered. And John Maynard Keynes, as this world-renowned economist, one of the greatest economic minds in the world ever, but certainly the greatest at this time, he was hugely instrumental in influencing the Americans on the New Deal and just basically pioneering Keynesianism in the 1930s, but let's just leave that for now. For the purpose of this story, what does Keynes ask for? He asked for roughly $5 to $6 billion in economic support for Britain, okay? But at the time, the man who's leading the US Treasury Department at that point, basically the man with the hands on the money, is a man called Fred N. Vinson, a US politician and policymaker. And Vinson just doesn't believe him. He just does not believe Keynes that Britain is battered. He does not believe Keynes that Britain is economically damaged. He thinks, well, hang on, this is Great Britain. This is the country with still the largest empire left on the planet. This once great economic nation, this nation that was at the heart of this huge imperial trading matrix. How could this once great nation be completely battered? So he doesn't believe Keynes. He knows that Britain's struggling post-war, but he doesn't believe that Britain's entirely bankrupt. So Keynes asks for around $6 billion. He basically receives about $3.7 billion. And even that was reluctant and not on the best terms for Britain. Okay. Keynes gave a significant amount to this in these negotiations. He basically ends up costing him his life. He actually dies in April 1946, and a lot of people at that time credited these negotiations with being hugely influential in killing him because of the amount of effort he put into these talks, the anxiety, because he was just determined to try to get some money out of the Americans to stop the complete disintegration of Britain, essentially, and make sure that Britain could survive as a nation. And he died of a heart attack in April 1946. So there is some merit in this view. Now, the reason why this is such an important story is because many US officials underestimated the depth of Europe's collapse. They believed Britain could adjust more quickly to this kind of post-World War II era. They believed the crisis was, severe-ish in Britain, but ultimately temporary. But it wasn't. What Keynes was able to expose wasn't just British weakness, it was the collapse of the European economic system. And Keynes recognized early that they needed American money and they needed American intervention. And that forced the US to basically ask itself a new question. Was it kind of a creditor nation, or was it now the architect of a post-war world? And eventually, by 1947, they have decided that they are going to be the architect of the kind of new world by intervening in Europe, the Marshall Plan money, the Truman Doctrine, where we see that shift from the Americans. But from 45 to 46, there is still that initial, shall we say, isolationist nostalgia or isolationist tendency that still emerges within the US administration. And that's really, really interesting. So, yeah, let's have a look now, and let's have a look at some of the key moments within these early attitudes towards Europe in 45 to 46, because basically there are 3 key moments across this period in time. The first one, and basically what I want you guys to think about is each of these reports in almost shifting the dial further towards aspects of geopolitical interventionism or kind of global interventionism or European interventionism by intervening and spending more money in Europe. So the first one is, of course, the Acheson report, okay, created by Dean Acheson at the time. He would later go on to be Secretary of State under Truman, but at this time, Acheson was actually Assistant Secretary of State for the Economy, so still an important diplomat, but not quite the top role. And Acheson warned that Europe's production systems and financial infrastructure were still at a complete standstill. He said this wasn't just humanitarian concern, it was actually structural, because if European capitalism collapsed, it would threaten the global economic order, including the US economy. And it's kind of the first big shift in this story, because Europe stops being this distant theatre theatre of politics, really, and becomes essential for American economic survival. And this is the emergence of kind of strategic planning from the start. So to break this down into a simple bullet point, we can say that the Acheson report stressed the situation in Europe required attention and warned that the financial system and production was at a standstill, would be a threat to the US capitalist order, and would essentially allow for communism to become potentially more rife. Now, this was a report straight after the war that wasn't taken seriously at the time enough by Harry Truman. But then, of course, as we move into 1946 and 47, we get more significant warnings. I suppose the key warning we could say is ultimately the long telegram that we've already looked at. Of course, this is George Kennan, the key architect of post-war foreign policy, American foreign policy, which is, of course, leads to the Truman Doctrine and the doctrine of containment. And that's important in warning the expansionist tendencies of communism. But this isn't really focused on necessarily kind of Western European and Central European economies. This is focused on the threat from Moscow. The difference between Kennan and these two we're going to look at, these are actually focusing on capitalist economies and the threat there, whereas Kennan's, of course, focused on the communist angle. So where do we go from here? Well, our third key report is, of course, Clayton, William Clayton's report from 1947. And Clayton basically returns from Europe on a kind of fact-finding mission, and he warns that millions are facing starvation. This is apparent in lots of different European nations, in Britain, in France, parts of the Netherlands as well. And he basically returns warning that millions are facing starvation. He argues that without substantial aid, Europe will experience economic and political disintegration. And this is the moment that the US shifts from kind of passive concern to active intervention. And isolationism gives way to kind of geopolitical strategy on the whole. And the Clayton report is really important, and it's something that students often miss. So please do try to memorize and remember this. And the point is, when we combine these, when we combine the kind of reports that are warning about these capitalist nations and how much they're struggling with the threat from communism, that's when we see this shift. And this is the impact here. I want you guys to get into your notes. What's the impact of these three in combination? Well, Europe is seen as essential to US economic survival. There's a shift from isolationist instinct to geopolitical intervention and strategic planning. And what does that strategic planning look like? Well, it looks like the Truman Doctrine, and of course, it looks like the Marshall Plan. And that is the outcome, or that is the impact of this. And of course, the ultimate irony is that everything that Keynes said was true 2 years before. He warned the Americans of this, but Fred Vinson, who at the time, as we said, was Treasury Secretary, and Truman didn't listen to him. They thought he was bluffing, and they thought he just wanted more money for Britain, but he was absolutely bang on the money. As a top economist, Keynes recognized this, and he largely cost him his life, these negotiations and these talks with these Americans who would just not give the money to the country that he loved to survive after Britain had fought so bravely during the war. But of course, it absolutely smashed the British economy so severely. Now, there is another kind of key bit of the course we need to be aware of this, because the spec actually says kind of US involvement in Europe and Britain. And there's nothing really specific about Britain that you need to know other than this, that this is kind of what most people see as the beginning of this concept called the special relationship. And you can reference this. If you do politics, you'll know what the special relationship means. But basically, the special relationship is exactly that. It's a special relationship between the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, or Britain, and the USA. And you can see Clement Attlee here, Attlee here. And you can see Truman here. This special relationship flourishing under them. But of course, it was strong before between Churchill and FDR. And the reason why Britain is seen as special by the Americans, several reasons. One, obviously the place on the Security Council, but also Britain is a country that has traditionally been stable. It's been stable, and it's been a strong US ally for a number of years. So the point is that if Britain were to basically disintegrate, then you're essentially giving up on having a strong world order. So Britain becomes a key pillar, a key avenue, a key ally for the Americans within Europe. That if Britain's on side, given its historic prestige when it comes to its empire, when it comes to its political stability, also when it comes to its role within the UN Security Council, and eventually that it would become the world's third nuclear nation in 1952, is it 52 or 53? I think it's 1952. Then that's one of the reasons why this relationship is so key there. So let's start progressing through this with a little bit more pacing. We know about these two individuals. We spoke about these two individuals in our last video, George Kennan and, of course, Churchill. We know Kennan, of course, for the long telegram, and Churchill for about a million different things. But for the purpose of this part of the course, for the Iron Curtain speech, both delivered in 1946. But the point that's so important about these two is they do help influence US foreign policy for the next 25 years, which we said is, of course, the doctrine of containment. And when we think about containment, the Marshall Plan is the economic and financial manifestation of containment and the Truman Doctrine. Because how do you keep capitalist countries capitalist? Well, you do it by giving them loads of free king money. Okay, so the Truman Doctrine. Let's get on and focus on the Truman Doctrine. That technically comes into Unit 2, but obviously it's really important here. In March 1947, Truman formalizes containment. He says that the USA would support free peoples resisting oppression through economic and financial aid. And this is crucial. Containment becomes doctrine. The US is no longer reacting, it is declaring long-term responsibility. And basically it does this. I mean, as we know, it sets the policy of containment for the next 25 years. It globalizes US responsibility. It leads to the Marshall Plan, which, as we said, is the financial and economic manifestation of the Truman Doctrine. $13.5 billion of aid to those 16 different European countries, as we'll look at in a moment. And it exacerbates tension that begins to form two different blocks, with Stalin calling it dollar imperialism, famously as his reaction. And from Moscow's perspective, this looks like ideological confrontation. There's no other way of looking at it from the American perspective. They don't see this as America helping to protect or save the starving economies of Western Europe. Stalin just sees it as direct dollar imperialism. And I suppose there is a hint of truth there as well, because there are some strings attached from the Americans. So let's have a look at this and let's think about what is in this for the Americans. What are the causes of the Marshall Plan? We know this. We spoke about this. We spoke about Clayton. We've spoken about Ackerson's report, and also we have spoken about Keynes and the wider context through why the Marshall Plan money is needed. It's largely because Europe is completely devastated by war. And all the things that Keynes said, there's some merit in it. I mean, Britain, the Attlee government in 1946 were drawing up plans for mass famine. There was a really long, horrendous winter, like a massive freeze, and there were major crop shortages, and they actually drew up plans for famine. And it had the weather have not have turned, there is a strong chance that Britain would have gone through quite a serious famine. Luckily, the weather did turn, and they were able to harvest food and also import more food. But rationing became really, really, really quite tight at the time. Also, the significant debt. So if we think about Britain as our case study, $21 billion worth of debt in 1945 at the end of the Second World War. It's the highest debt to GDP ratio in British history. As you can see here, kind of around 250% debt to GDP, which is really, 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 really high at the time. Of course, this money adjusted for inflation today would be significantly higher, just FYI for any budding economists. And the design of the Marshall Plan was to help revive the economies of Western Europe and create this stable Western bloc, and obviously contain the spread of communism. Because if these economies collapsed, then communism could win democratically. And we have to contextualize that communist parties were gaining strength in France and Italy at the time, and therefore the USA was fearing losing Europe, not for invasion, but through the ballot box, actually. So containment required this economic revival that was brought in by the Marshall Plan. So let's have a look at the Marshall Plan, okay? The Marshall Plan, of course, let's just go to this here. The Marshall Plan was announced by Secretary of State George Marshall in June 1947, and it was ratified in the USA by 1948, which is when the money really started flowing in. But just a reminder, that money, that $300 billion to Greece in 1947, some people do kind of illustrate as the precursor to the Marshall Plan, and some people do include it in the Marshall Plan money. It depends on the way in which you aggregate it. Don't panic too much about this, but just remember that kind of Greece Civil War point and that Greek point there. So that rant aside, $15.5 billion to 16 countries over the next 5 years. Britain, of course, would be the largest recipient, receiving about $3.3 billion. And that was on top of the previous loan that they'd already gained in 1945 that Keynes organised. Actually, this one had much better terms for Britain than the earlier loan, which had quite, well, I mean, not high interest by today's standards, but at the time, fairly high interest. This was to run from 1947 through to 1952, so these would be kind of 5-year loans, but it wasn't charity. There were conditions, and the conditions were that some had to be spent on US goods, which would of course increase US production and help revive their economy. Well, not really revive, but help their economy boom, and it absolutely does that in the 1950s. Economic data also had to be shared with Washington, and it also encouraged European cooperation. And this is where we see basically the emergence of economic cooperation within Europe, which basically leads to the creation of the European steel and coal community, okay, or coal and steel community, and then eventually that would become the EEC, which today we know as the EU. So everything is kind of connected here. And this wasn't just recovery, this was kind of block construction, because Western Europe begins to integrate economically, but crucially around American leadership, which is really important. And obviously the Soviets see this as dollar imperialism here accordingly. So let's just go into this in a bit more detail. If we look at the slide here, we can see, oh, sorry, just bear with me one moment. We can see the $13.5 billion and the 16 different countries it was given to, with Britain coming in top with around $3.3 billion. France coming in second, West Germany and Italy kind of tying here for third. We've got the money that's given in the Greek Civil War, but then more follows afterwards, and a number of other countries that take the money. Notice here Yugoslavia that Tito does take some money, which of course furthers that divide between him and Stalin, which is really interesting. And we've got some lots and lots of fascinating kind of documents and cartoons and posters from the time that illustrate the success of the Marshall Plan and this idea of everyone in it together. And what you tend to see, and I love this as an idea, it's like American money shooting into this kind of windmill and then wind blowing it around. And I really like that metaphor. Why? Because I think it leads to economic production. This idea that, you know, a shock of American intervention can then lead to this economy turning and generating, getting stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. And I love that idea really, really well because of the obvious economic links. So just one final thing that I want to go back to here is this idea that the condition of the loans and this kind of acceleration of European unity. Because what ends up being created is, I didn't put this on my slides, did I? No, I didn't, but it's fine. No, I didn't, but it's absolutely fine. So basically what's created in April 1947 is the European Economic Cooperation, or the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, OEEC. And it's created in April 1948. It's established by 16 Western European states, and it's basically designed to coordinate the distribution of the Marshall Aid. That's absolutely fine. That's really, really simple. But what it then leads to is it basically helps lay the foundations for the European Coal and Steel Community, ECSC. Okay. I'm not going to write that out in full, but that's in 1951. That would eventually, by 1957, become the EEC, European Economic Community, that then would become the European Union, actually eventually by the 1990s. So when you think about the EU and all the debates we've had of the last kind of decade over Brexit, a lot of it actually comes from American leadership, because what the Americans wanted is they wanted a closer, more integrated Europe, because that more integrated Europe can be a capitalist Europe, and then they can have stronger and closer ties with the Americans. Now, whilst the British are involved in this, okay, this here, which is of course, the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, when that then metastasizes and grows into the European Coal and Steel Community, the British don't join in 1951. And that's one of their reasons why they're outside the EEC, and they only join the EEC in 1973. So they're not able to shape the institution into what it would become. But let's just forget that for now, because it's not hugely relevant. It's just a nice little extra bullet point there, shall we say. So what is the Soviet reaction? Well, this is where the tension really escalates, because Molotov walks out of the Paris Peace Conference, who is, of course, one of the key diplomats within Stalin's communist administration. Okay, so Molotov walks out of the Paris Peace Conference, and that's because he's absolutely furious about what he sees as dollar imperialism and blatant US capitalist economic bribery. Czechoslovakia and Poland initially show interest in Marshall Aid, but Stalin forces them to withdraw. And this is after a period of roughly 2 weeks, where Stalin's deliberating how to respond to the Marshall Plan money, but then he forces Poland and Czechoslovakia to withdraw. Why? Well, because economic penetration is political penetration. If Eastern Europe integrates economically with the West, then Soviet security is clearly weakened. So what does this lead to? Well, basically, in September 1947, the impact of this is that it leads to the creation of Cominform, which we know is closer integration of communist economies and also communist kind of political structures. And it also accelerates the Sovietization and consolidation of the Eastern Bloc, with increasing acceleration of communist parties and communist Soviet influence in Czechoslovakia and Hungary, which were the two main players that weren't yet formally under Moscow's iron rule. So, interestingly, the Marshall Plan doesn't really create division, it just accelerates the previous division that has already existed, which I think is fascinating. And there's a lovely little cartoon here that you can look at, which is from Punch in 1947, that basically shows Molotov pulling down the Marshall Plan, and the caption reads, "He's done it again." And this is Molotov basically booting off about the Marshall Plan and the kind of Western anger at Molotov's decision to walk out of the Paris Peace Conference. Oh, sorry, not the Paris Peace Conference, the Paris Conference in 1947. So we are going to do our fourth video on Germany, of course, the next bit of the spec, but it is just worth very briefly looking at it now because it does come into the end of this unit. So let's have a look at US attitudes to Germany. So just a quick reminder, the US traditionally wanted a unified Germany after the Second World War. Eventually, that was the end-term goal, but they were, of course, okay with the division into 4 different zones, but eventually that's the end goal, a unified Germany. But they then modify their position. They modify their position essentially post the Long Telegram. The thinking changes because the fear is a unified Germany would fall under communist influence. So therefore, what you don't want is a unified Germany. You actually want a divided Germany. And the reason why they were certain it might come under communist influence is because they were looking at what was happening in Eastern Europe, and they recognized that Britain and France at the time were actually just fairly weak. Their economies weren't booming yet. They still need the Marshall Plan money to flow in and begin to increase and accelerate kind of Western capitalist unity. So if Germany does reunify in 1948, 1949, what's going to happen? It could fall under communist influence. So the solution is, well, why don't we just create a strong West Germany, which is much more preferable to the Americans because it can act as an economic anchor, it can act as a Western capitalist state and a pioneer for Western capitalist values in the center of Europe. That's a pretty major strategic shift for the Americans, and actually weirdly Germany becomes kind of this economic anchor of Western Europe, but also a central pillar of containment, we could say. So then what happens? Well, then we get the formation of Bizonia in January 1947, which is when Britain and the USA merged their zones. And if my animations are working correctly, wowzers, look at that. We've got the direct transition from this to this integration and move towards a kind of single zone between Britain and the USA, and that is a signal towards a West German state. That's the key thing here that angers the USSR significantly, because it's a move towards a West German state, and Stalin sees it as a violation of the Potsdam spirit, that spirit, the idea of dividing Germany into 4 zones and having these different influences in Germany. And this gets worse, of course, in 1948, when the Western zones introduced the Deutschmark, okay? Why? Well, because the USSR sees it as the consolidation of Western economic power, and basically as a formal example of, go back to our phrase, dollar imperialism, okay? There we go. And in response, well, it triggers the Berlin blockade. And the Cold War now moves from economic tension to direct confrontation. And this is the moment where division becomes much more physical, and we got our first major flashpoint or crisis point within the early Cold War that obviously leads us directly into Unit 4. So we're going to pause there when it comes to content, but not before we can have our final evaluation slides. This is our final evaluation slide, summing up everything from here, but of course you can rewatch the video to help you with this. So let's go through this. The USA's post-war policy towards Britain focused on building a firm, lasting alliance, largely through this idea of the special relationship. And a reminder, even though there is relationship, even though there is the initial issue over Keynes and the loan that Keynes wanted, not getting a $6 billion loan, by the time the attitude shifted by 47 to 48, Britain is the largest recipient of the Marshall Plan money. Also, by 1947, US thinking shifting from the isolationism of the 20s and 30s into a much more proactive interventionist foreign policy. The Marshall Plan was, of course, central to this strategy. And the Marshall Plan, which of course is the economic and financial manifestation of the Truman Doctrine, I'm going to keep saying that until you guys get it, can be seen as the part of the deteriorating US-USSR relationship rather than the sole cause of the Cold War. So almost its acceleration as opposed to the sole cause. But I know that, me and Mr. Sayer actually do believe that it's a really, really important early cause. So you can happily grill us on that. And then finally, it contributes, and the Marshall Plan links directly to events in Germany, and it leads to the creation of a West German state eventually, but almost the beginnings of this West German state and the division of Europe into ideological, economic and strategic blocks. And it is, of course, the main cause of the FBC, which is not FC Barcelona in reverse. It is, of course, the First Berlin Crisis, as we'll look at in our fourth unit. So, kind of closing line from me, I suppose I've got to say something fairly poignant. I think what this unit tells us a lot about is this idea of economic collapse and that transition from isolationism towards kind of like geopolitical intervention and strategic calculation from the Americans, but from the Soviet end is viewed as kind of suspicion ultimately. And it's really interesting because this is classic Cold War tension, isn't it? This is classic Cold War vibes ultimately. Why? Because it doesn't begin with tanks. It begins with loans. And that is the Cold War for us there. I feel like that wasn't really a poignant enough line to lead on. It begins with it begins with loans, not tanks. But we'll go with it. Happy revising. I hope that helped.